While much of East Africa is dry, many places over 1,000 meters high are likely to contain forest. Collectively, this forest is called East African Montane Forest, stretching from the Kilimanjaro region of Tanzania, continuing along much of Kenya's Rift Valley, and then onto a number of isolated peaks like Mount Elgon, Mount Marsabit, and finally the Imatong Mountains of South Sudan. It is part of a much broader forest region which stretches across Central Africa to the Atlantic by way of the Congo and West Africa. For the past few million years, this forest band has expanded and contracted numerous times due to broader global fluctuations between cold dry periods and warm wet periods. When the climate is cold and dry, savanna expands and the forest shrinks up to the highest peaks. In the warmer periods, the forest expands again down into the savanna. Over time, this has sped up the process of speciation, the process by which one species divides into two or three or four or even more species. During dry periods, when the forest is not joined together continuously, a given species is confined to a number of different forest islands. Over long enough periods of time, this one species will divide into several different species. Thus, East African forests sometimes have species which are found on a few forested peaks, but nowhere else. These include the likes of Mount Kenya and bush viper and the bongo antelope found in the Aberdare Mountains. A dramatic example of East African forest speciation is the camellia. Most of the forested volcanic massifs which jut out into the arid north of Kenya have their own species of chameleon found nowhere else. Mount Marsabit has its own species, as does Mount Kenya, the Aberdare Mountains, the Cherangani Hills, and Mount Kulal off the coast of Lake Turkana. While for the past 10,000 years or so, East Africa has been in a warm period where forest growth is at a maximum, the past 10,000 years have also witnessed the rise of a new ecological force, human migration. In the past few thousand years, the development of farming has pushed forests further up mountain slopes. This has been exacerbated in the past century, first during the colonial period, where tea growing and forestry led to about 30% loss of forest cover, and then in the independence era, where land grabs and the conversion of forest into farmland has continued. The original hunter-gatherer people who lived in these forests are now, sadly, almost all gone. The last of this world can still be found in the Mau forests on the western slopes of the Rift Valley. Here, the last of these people, the Ogiek, cling onto the edges of the forest, with the government seemingly bent on driving them out. Ironically, it is under the banner of conservation that forest peoples in places like Kenya and Uganda have been forced out of the forest. As the forests have shrunk, the small patches which are left have become nature reserves, so as to prevent them from disappearing completely. But the forests have become more conservation orientated. The idea that some people continue to live and hunt in these places has become intolerable to the authorities, who increasingly view forests as places which should be devoid of people. Of course, the much greater irony is that the farming communities surrounding the forests are responsible for the vast majority of the deforestation, which has driven hunter-gatherer communities into smaller and smaller enclaves of the forests which remain. An East African court ruling in 2022 declared that the Kenyan government owes millions in compensation for forcing hunter-gatherers out of the Mau forest, although the government has been slow to act on the ruling. While most of Kenya's mountain forests have strong protection, such as Mount Kenya and the Aberdare Mountains, which are referred to by indigenous people as the Melalek, other forests are much more susceptible to destruction, not least the aforementioned Mau Forest complex, which has undergone several decades of brutal land grabs, and the forests of the Cherangani Hills in western Kenya, which are on the verge of disappearing completely. You don't need to have an advanced science degree to understand that this is a kind of collective suicide. For the most part, Kenya is a very dry country with less than 10% of it covered under trees. The moist forest covered slopes provide water for large parts of the country which are arid. As these forests recede due to reasons of political expediency or just stupid greed, the country becomes increasingly vulnerable to East Africa's notorious dry periods, which can sometimes last years. About half of Nairobi, Kenya's capital city, is located within the East African Montane Forest ecosystem. The other half of the city is Savannah. It's a city located literally on the boundary of two vast ecological zones, one stretching all the way to the Atlantic, the other to the Indian Ocean. Prior to British colonization, Nairobi was a meeting point for trade between the Kikuyu, who lived mainly in the forested regions, and the Maasai, who lived in the savanna regions. Today, predominantly the wealthy live in the forested regions of the city, areas such as Westlands, Mutangori, and Karen. Given the hunger for land in the city and the fast-growing population, it is something of a miracle that there are still a few stands of indigenous East African montane forest left. The most well-known of these is the Karura Forest. The largest, but much less well-known, is Ngong Forest. The reason Ngong Forest exists is because the British, who had built a railway line known as the Lunatic Express from Mombasa on the coast to Kampala, the capital city of Uganda today, needed a supply of wood in the city to replace railway sleepers. The British also used the forest as a sort of leisure reserve where they built a race course and some other sporting amenities and other activities such as horse riding. About a century ago, at the eastern end of the forest, the British also ceded land to Sudanese Nubians who had helped the British fight in World War I. The area was known as Kibra, which in the Nubian language means land of forest. Over the years, the Nubians have been displaced by migrants, and today the area is known as Kibera, probably one of the largest informal settlements in East Africa. In subsequent years, about half of the remaining forest has been lost to land grabbing, involving corrupt politicians in collusion with churches, schools, and businesses. These land grabs in the Ngong Forest were revealed in the 2004 Ndungu Land Commission, an investigation into illegal allocations of land in Kenya. As is often the case with these kinds of reports, although the perpetrators are known, few have been held accountable, and little of the stolen land has ever been returned to forest land. This may be due to the fact that many implicated still wield important political and economic power today in Kenya. Given this, it's something of a miracle that Ngong Forest survives today. In my opinion, it is Nairobi's best-kept secret. Despite being located within the metropolitan area, there are times where I've walked for 2 hours in the forest and not come across a single other human being. Unlike Karura Forest, which is predominantly made up of Australian eucalyptus plantations, trees which suck all the moisture out of the ground and which support hardly any indigenous animal life, Ngong is mainly made up of indigenous montane forest and thus supports a wider range of animals, including Nairobi rarities such as leopard, hyena, the parrot-like Narina trogon, and even a family of African crowned eagles. As far as I know, there are only 2 or 3 other individual eagles of this species living in the city. There are also some amazing trees, including some giant African fig trees, which are sacred to the Kikuyu people. The forest today is managed by the Ngong Forest Sanctuary, a body which includes local civil society groups which surround the forest. The staff include members who have lived in the forest their entire lives and are incredibly knowledgeable and friendly. There is also a small nursery where you can buy indigenous forest plants and do your bit to help expand the forest ecosystem again. If you find yourself in Nairobi and are in need of some forest bathing, as the Japanese call it, I highly recommend a stroll in Ngong Forest Reserve. Thanks for watching.